Alright, let's go. Number 10, the coelacanth, a fish that spent 80 million years being dead and then showed up in a fish market. On the 22nd of December, 1938, a museum curator named Marjorie Courtenay-Latimer was walking the docks of East London, South Africa, not the English city, the South African port, as she routinely did, looking through the catch haul of a local trawler captain named Hendrik Goosen. Goosen's boat, the Narini, had been working the waters off the Chalumna River mouth, dragging nets at depths where the seafloor dropped away into something that maps of that era simply labeled deep water and left deliberately vague. Courtenay-Latimer was employed by the East London Museum as its director, a position that paid almost nothing and required her to scavenge trawler discards for specimens worth preserving. On this particular morning, among a pile of sharks and rays heaped on the dock and already beginning to smell in the December heat, she pulled aside a tarpaulin and found something that stopped her moving for a moment that witnesses described as long enough to be notable. It was a fish. It was the wrong kind of fish. It was 177 centimeters long, steel blue, with thick armored scales that caught the light differently than any fish scale she had seen, and its fins were lobed, fleshy, almost limb-like, articulated at the base as though they were designed to push against something solid. The fish was dead. It had been dead for some hours, and it had not existed for approximately 65 million years. Courtenay-Latimer sketched it in her notebook and sent a description by letter to J. L. B. Smith, a chemistry lecturer at Rhodes University who also served informally as the most knowledgeable fish taxonomist in southern Africa. Smith received the letter days later, read the sketch description, and according to his own account, put the letter down and picked it up again 3 times before responding. When he finally saw the preserved specimen, preserved imperfectly, because Courtenay-Latimer had been unable to reach him in time and had been forced to have the fish mounted by a taxidermist, destroying much of the soft tissue that would have been most scientifically valuable, he identified it without hesitation as a coelacanth, a member of a taxonomic order called the Actinistia, a lineage that the fossil record indicated had gone extinct at the end of the Cretaceous period. Roughly 65 million years before anyone in that room had been born, Smith walked around the mounted specimen 3 times, then he sat down on the floor of the museum. A museum assistant who was present reported that Smith did not speak for approximately 4 minutes. The announcement reached the public through a press release issued by the East London Museum in January 1939, which described the fish in careful institutional language as a specimen of considerable scientific interest. The South African press rendered this as something closer to a sea monster discovery, and several newspapers ran the story alongside photographs that made the fish appear larger and more dramatic than the actual specimen. What the press release did not mention, and what Smith's subsequent academic paper addressed only in a footnote, was the condition of the specimen, specifically that the preserved fish was missing its stomach, its kidneys, its swim bladder, and most of the soft tissue that would have answered the most urgent questions about how the animal actually functioned. The coelacanth that reached the scientific record was a shell of the animal that had been found. Smith's paper, published in the journal Nature in March 1939, formally named the species Latimeria chalumnae and requested that any further specimens be reported immediately to South African authorities. The South African government issued a monetary reward, enough to motivate any fisherman who pulled in a strange catch to pay attention. 14 years passed. A second specimen was not caught until December 1952, this time near the Comoros Islands, more than 2,000 kilometers from where the first had been found. But the 14-year gap was not the part that continued to generate quiet disagreement in the literature. The part that did was this: coelacanths, when the Comoros population was eventually studied in depth in the 1980s and 1990s, were found to inhabit submarine cave systems at depths between 100 and 400 meters, moving only at night, descending during daylight hours into water cold enough that their metabolism slowed to something approaching dormancy. They had been there the entire time. Fishermen in the Comoros had been catching them occasionally for generations, using them as a rough surface scouring material to patch bicycle inner tubes, because the scales were abrasive enough to work as sandpaper. The fish that the Western scientific world treated as a once-in-a-century discovery had been, in the lived experience of people who were not consulted, an unremarkable and slightly annoying bycatch. The Comoros population alone was later estimated at perhaps 300 to 500 individual animals, not a thriving species but not a ghost either. A population that size had been living in those caves, undisturbed, through the entire sweep of recorded human history in the region, through the age of sail and the age of empires and 2 world wars, descending each morning into cold dark water that no trawl net had been long enough to reach until Goosen's boat on that particular December morning dragged its net across exactly the right patch of seafloor. Number 9, the Wollemi Pine, a tree that grew undiscovered for 200 million years inside a canyon that is a 2-hour drive from Sydney. On the 10th of September 1994, a National Parks and Wildlife Service officer named David Noble was abseiling into a remote sandstone canyon in the Wollemi National Park, approximately 150 kilometers northwest of the Sydney Central Business District, during what his log described as a routine reconnaissance descent into an area that had not been formally surveyed. Noble was an experienced bushwalker who had made similar descents in that park on multiple previous occasions, and the canyon he entered that morning, which had no official name in any park registry, and which Noble had visited once before without descending fully, was unremarkable by the standards of the Blue Mountains region. Sheer walls, a narrow slot of sky overhead, a creek at the bottom running over orange rock. Noble descended approximately 80 meters and landed at the base. He walked along the creek for a short distance. Then he stopped and looked at the trees that were growing against the canyon walls, and he broke off a small piece of one of them, put it in his pocket, and climbed back out. The branch Noble had pocketed was taken to the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney, where botanist Wynne Jones examined it, and by her own subsequent account, assumed initially that it had been mislabeled, that it had come from a greenhouse specimen or a private collection, because the structure of the bark, the arrangement of the leaves, and the waxy texture of the foliage did not match any plant recorded as living in that region or anywhere else. The specimen was passed to Ken Hill, a botanist specializing in Australian flora, who cross-referenced it against morphological records and against the fossil record, and arrived at a conclusion that he described in his notes as one that he spent several days attempting to disprove before accepting. The tree was a conifer belonging to a lineage known only from fossils of the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. The family to which it belonged, Araucariaceae, was known from living specimens. The Norfolk Island pine and the bunya pine both belonged to that family, but the particular genus Noble had found, later named Wollemia, was known exclusively from fossil material estimated at between 200 million and 90 million years old. The trees growing in the canyon were their direct living equivalents, architecturally unchanged. The New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service moved quickly to classify the canyon's location as confidential. The official announcement, made in December 1994, named the species Wollemia nobilis in honor of Noble, and confirmed its status as a living fossil of extraordinary rarity, but withheld the coordinates of the canyon from public release. The park released photographs of the trees, striking images showing their distinctive bubble-textured dark bark and their layered fern-like canopy, but the canyon's location was not disclosed, and park rangers were instructed not to confirm or deny its position to inquiries. The announcement itself was careful, measured, and conveyed less urgency than the underlying discovery warranted. In the years following, the Wollemi Pine population was assessed. The total number of individual adult trees found in the canyon system was fewer than 100. Subsequent surveys found a small number of additional populations in neighboring canyons, bringing the total wild population to what park authorities described as a small number in the low hundreds, a figure that has never been formally published with precision. The canyon's precise location remains officially undisclosed, though it has been widely speculated about, and the park itself is a public hiking destination. And yet the unresolved element is not about secrecy. It is about proximity. The canyon where those trees were growing is located within a national park that received more than 1.5 million visitors in the year Noble made his descent. It is accessible from a major Australian city. The sandstone canyon system in which Wollemia nobilis had been living continuously for a period of time that encompasses the entire existence of every mammal species on Earth, lay within the outer boundary of what residents of Sydney would describe, without irony, as their general backyard. The tree had survived the mass extinction event that ended the Cretaceous, survived the shifting of continents, survived the arrival of the first Aboriginal peoples tens of thousands of years ago, survived European colonization, survived the industrial development of the continent around it, and was finally seen by a scientist not because anyone went looking for it, but because a park officer decided on one particular morning to finish a descent he had started on a previous visit and not completed. The total known wild population of the oldest tree species on Earth, measured end to end, would fit within 2 city blocks. Number 8. The Laotian rock rat. A rodent so ancient its entire taxonomic family was known only from 11-million-year-old fossils until it was found on a meat market table in Laos. In the spring of 2005, a team of field researchers from the Wildlife Conservation Society, working in the Khamwan limestone karst region of central Laos, entered a local food market in the town of Thakhek. The team's purpose was documenting wildlife trade, cataloging what was being sold and identifying any species that might be subject to trafficking regulations. One of the researchers, Dr. Robert Timmons, picked up what appeared to be a small rodent from a vendor's table where it had been laid out for sale as food, and turned it over in his hands for a moment before setting it back down. The animal was approximately 40 centimeters long, gray-brown, with a blunt snout and a long, rope-like tail. It moved initially like no rodent Timmons was familiar with, slowly and with a deliberateness that he later described in published notes as non-typical. The team purchased the specimen. A second individual was found alive in a nearby restaurant. They bought that one as well. The specimens were described and analyzed by a team that included Dr. Mary Dawson of the Carnegie Museum of Natural History and Dr. Kimura Masanaru of Osaka University, who independently concluded, examining the skull morphology and dentition, that the animal could not be assigned to any known living rodent family. The teeth were distinctive and diagnostic. The structure of the molars, particularly their multicusped, low-crowned configuration, corresponded not to any modern rodent but to fossils of the family Diatomiidae, a lineage represented in the paleontological record by specimens recovered from sites in Pakistan, China, and Thailand, the youngest of which were approximately 11 million years old. The animal had been extinct by the available record for 11 million years. It was formally described in the journal Science in May 2006 under the name Laotian enigmamus. The local population in Thakek, when asked about the animal, produced a vernacular name for it without hesitation. It was called Kanayu, and it was, as far as the vendors and local hunters were concerned, a local forest rodent of no particular significance. It was not considered rare. It was not a food source that required effort to obtain. The hunters who supplied it to the market described finding it without difficulty in the limestone karst formations nearby, in rock crevices, along the bases of the cliffs in the undergrowth at the edge of the forest. The implication embedded in these accounts was that the animal was encountered with enough regularity that it had acquired a stable name, a culinary role, and an unremarkable place in the local economy. The formal description in Science was met with considerable attention in paleontology circles, and was widely cited as one of the more significant zoological discoveries of the decade. The location of the population, the Kamwan limestone karst, was noted, and subsequent surveys attempted to establish the animal's range and status. Those surveys found the animal in a restricted zone of limestone karst terrain, and assessed it as locally present but not abundant. A formal conservation assessment produced in the years following classified it as a species of conservation concern. But what the scientific response did not address in any formal capacity was the timeline of the market trade. The vendor in Thakek had not been selling a single novel animal. She had been selling them. The Kanayu appeared in local markets with enough regularity to have established a trade price. Which means that for a period of time that no one has formally estimated, weeks, years, decades, or longer, a species the scientific world considered to have been absent from the Earth since the Miocene epoch was being hunted, transported, priced, sold, purchased, and eaten, in quantities sufficient to sustain a market, across a geographic zone that spans at minimum the full extent of the Kamwan karst, which runs for roughly over 4,000 square kilometers of difficult terrain along the Laos-Vietnam border. Number 7. The Goblin Shark, a living relic of the Cretaceous seafloor that surfaces so rarely and so briefly that most marine biologists have never seen one alive. On the 23rd of April, 2014, a shrimp fisherman operating in the Gulf of Mexico approximately 200 kilometers southeast of Key West hauled his nets and found, tangled in the mesh and still living, a pink-skinned, soft-bodied shark approximately 4.5 meters in length, with a long, blade-shaped rostrum projecting from its forehead and a set of jaws that, when the animal opened them, extended forward out of the face on a mechanism that resembled an unfolding pocket knife. The fisherman, Carl Moore, used a knife to cut the netting and release the animal. He had taken a photograph with his phone before doing so. The photograph he submitted to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, was the first confirmed sighting of a goblin shark, Mitsukurina ostoni, in Gulf of Mexico waters in more than 120 years of recorded fishing activity in that region. The goblin shark had been known to science since 1898, when a Japanese fisherman caught one near Yokohama, and a specimen was sent to the American naturalist David Starr Jordan, who formally described it. By 2014, fewer than 50 specimens had ever been recovered worldwide, making it one of the least observed large shark species on the planet. Dr. John Carlson of the NOAA Southeast Fisheries Science Center, who analyzed the photograph and confirmed the identification, noted that the animal captured on Moore's phone represented a significantly larger individual than most previously recorded specimens, and that its presence in the Gulf of Mexico at depths shallow enough to be caught in a shrimp trawl was not consistent with the species' known behavioral profile. Goblin sharks are associated with deepwater environments, typically operating at depths between 200 and 900 meters along continental slopes and seamounts. The Gulf of Mexico trawl had been set at a depth of approximately 360 meters, which placed it within the species' known range but at the boundary of where shrimp trawls typically operated. Moore's photograph was shared by NOAA via social media and picked up by international news organizations within 48 hours. The coverage it generated described the animal in terms that emphasized its physical appearance, the extensible jaws, the pink coloration caused by subcutaneous blood vessels visible through the translucent skin, the elongated rostrum, and largely presented the event as an anomalous intrusion of deep-sea strangeness into shallow waters. What the coverage did not address was the trawl depth, which was well within the continental shelf zone and not an area that marine biologists would characterize as exceptionally deep. The narrative of an animal from the abyss surfacing unexpectedly was more compelling than the more accurate framing, that the goblin shark's depth range overlaps significantly with waters that are commercially fished. The species' behavioral ecology was formally assessed in a review published by Kazuhiro Nakaya and colleagues that noted with institutional restraint that so little was known about the living animal that basic questions, its reproductive mode, its diet composition, its depth preferences across life stages, could not be answered with available data. The species was formally listed as least concern on the IUCN Red List, a classification that the listing authors noted was based on an absence of evidence of population decline rather than evidence of population stability. And yet what the goblin shark's reappearance in the Gulf of Mexico actually demonstrated was something the NOAA statement did not emphasize, that in over a century of increasingly intensive commercial fishing across the Gulf, during which thousands of trawlers had dragged nets across millions of square kilometers of seafloor, the species had been caught once before in 1898 and then not again until 2014, not because it had been absent. The goblin shark's jaw mechanism, which fires the dentary forward on a sling of hyoid cartilage to strike prey, is adapted for hunting in darkness at depth, where it has been doing exactly that silently, continuously, invisibly for a lineage that the fossil record traces back to the early Cretaceous, roughly 125 million years ago. The Gulf of Mexico alone covers roughly 1.5 million square kilometers. Carl Moore's net crossed approximately the same fraction of that as a single line drawn across a football field crosses the field. Number 6. The Frilled Shark, an animal with 300 teeth arranged in 25 rows whose deepest behavioral instincts appear to have been set during the Carboniferous period. On the 21st of January 2007, staff at Owashima Marine Park in Numazu, Japan, received a call from a local fisherman who had spotted something in shallow water near the surface, an animal approximately 1.5 meters long, eel-like in its movement, swimming in a slow lateral undulation at a depth of less than 2 meters. Park staff arrived and removed the animal from the water. It was alive. It died shortly after being placed in a holding tank within a matter of hours, which the park's marine biologists attributed to thermal stress. The animal had been in water significantly warmer than its physiological tolerance. Before it died, staff filmed it. The footage, which was several minutes long, showed the animal moving through the water in a manner that marine biologists reviewing it later described as consistent with an ambush predator behavior pattern, slow, sinuous, the body held in a lateral S-curve that the literature described as analogous to the strike posture of a cobra. The animal was a frilled shark, Chlamydosleches anguineus, a species known from the deep ocean but almost never observed alive. The frilled shark takes its name from the frilled, ruffled appearance of its gill slits, of which it has 6 pairs rather than the 5 characteristic of most modern sharks. Dr. Sho Tanaka of Tokai University, who examined the Owashima specimen and reviewed the footage, noted that the animal's anatomy placed it at a taxonomic distance from modern sharks that was not simply a matter of superficial difference. Its jaw structure, the position of its mouth at the very tip of its snout rather than on the underside of the head as in most sharks, and the arrangement of its teeth, each tooth trifurcated, 3-pronged in 25 rows for a total of around 300 teeth, represented a structural plan that the fossil record documented as having been established in the Carboniferous period, somewhere between 350 and 300 million years ago. The frilled shark had been photographed alive on only a handful of previous occasions, all of them in deepwater ROV footage, all of them at depths between 200 and 1,000 meters. The Owashima footage circulated widely via early internet video sharing platforms and was picked up by international news outlets in the days following the shark's capture and death. Coverage emphasized the prehistoric nature of the animal and its unusual appearance, and several outlets described it as a living fossil, a term that biologists use with some reluctance, because it implies stasis that the organism's internal biochemistry and genetics may not actually exhibit. The park released a statement noting the rarity of the event and expressing regret at the animal's death. There was no formal scientific paper published about the Owashima individual specifically. The species had been known to science since 1884, when a specimen was described by Samuel Garman of Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology, based on material collected from Japanese waters. Its distribution was understood to be wide. It had been caught in Atlantic and Pacific and Indian Ocean waters, but its biology remained almost entirely unknown. A study published in 2012 by researchers including Kazuhiro Nakaya examined specimens collected as bycatch in deep-sea fisheries, and confirmed that the frilled shark was an active pursuit predator rather than a bottom-dwelling ambush feeder as had been assumed, and that its flexible spine and large liver allowed it to hover motionless at depth, adjusting buoyancy like a submarine holding station. But the question that the Owashima event raised and that no subsequent research has definitively answered is the behavioral one. The animal was observed at the surface, in water too warm for its physiology, moving in what appeared to be a hunting pattern. It was not disabled. It was not beaching itself. It was swimming with direction and apparent purpose in an environment that would kill it within hours. The frilled shark lineage, which has been hunting continuously in deep water since before the dinosaurs existed, since before flowering plants existed, since before the Atlantic Ocean had opened to its current width, appears to have retained a behavioral repertoire that can override the physical evidence that the environment is wrong. It swam up into light and warmth it could not survive and kept hunting anyway. The species' current range has been estimated to extend across every major ocean basin on Earth. What percentage of that range has ever been directly observed by a human being is not a number that appears anywhere in the literature. Number 5. The megamouth shark, a species of large shark averaging over 4 meters in length that was entirely unknown to science until one swallowed a Navy anchor off Hawaii. On the 15th of November 1976, the United States Navy research vessel AFB-14 was conducting operations approximately 40 kilometers northeast of the island of Oahu, Hawaii, at a site being used to test parachute sea anchors, large fabric drogues deployed at depth to slow or stabilize vessels in open water. When the crew hauled back one of the sea anchors from a depth of approximately 165 meters, they found that a large shark had become entangled in the parachute fabric and was hanging from it dead. The crew hoisted the animal aboard. It was 4.5 meters long, had a very large wide mouth lined with hundreds of small hooked teeth, and had small eyes and a distinctly soft, flabby body relative to other sharks of comparable length. Navy personnel aboard photographed it and stored the body in a freezer. The animal was subsequently transferred to the Kaneohe Marine Corps Air Station, where it was examined by Dr. Leighton Taylor of the Waikiki Aquarium and a team that included ichthyologists from the Bernice Pauahi Bishop Museum in Honolulu. Taylor and his colleagues examining the specimen over a period of days concluded that they were looking at an animal they could not place in any known family of sharks. The breadth of the jaw was unlike that of any described species. The terminal mouth, positioned at the very front of the blunt, rounded snout, could open to a width sufficient to engulf a large sea turtle whole. The interior of the mouth was pale, almost luminescent-looking, and lined with light-reflecting tissue that the researchers hypothesized might serve as a lure for the bioluminescent deep-sea organisms the shark apparently fed upon. The gill rakers, fine comb-like structures on the gill arches used to filter small organisms from the water, were delicate and numerous. The animal was, in terms of its feeding mechanism, convergent with the whale shark and the basking shark, both filter feeders, but belonged to none of the families that contained those species. It was formally described in 1983, 7 years after its capture, in a monograph that established a new genus, species, and family, Megachasma pelagios, the megamouth shark. The official record of the megamouth's discovery as it appeared in the scientific literature was straightforward. A new species caught as accidental bycatch in Navy equipment, described after thorough examination, assigned its taxonomic position, and added to the catalog of known life. The 7-year gap between capture and formal description was unusual, larger than typical for a new species, and was attributed in the monograph to the time required to fully analyze the specimen and confirm that it represented a genuinely novel family rather than a misidentified member of a known group. Between 1976 and 2012, fewer than 60 megamouth sharks were recorded worldwide. They were caught in fishing nets, found stranded on beaches, and occasionally filmed by ROVs in deep water. No population estimate has ever been produced with confidence. The species range has been confirmed to encompass the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans. And yet the animal is over 4 meters long. It is, in terms of body mass, one of the largest fish on Earth. It filters enormous volumes of water through its wide-open mouth, straining copepods and small shrimp from the deep scattering layer, the band of marine organisms that rises toward the surface each night and descends each morning, a mass migration of billions of small animals that occurs in every ocean on Earth, and has been occurring continuously for hundreds of millions of years. The megamouth follows that layer up and down in a daily vertical migration that takes it through hundreds of meters of water column. It does this in every major ocean. It has presumably been doing this or something functionally identical since its lineage diverged from the ancestors of modern sharks during the Cretaceous. The question that its discovery raised, not the one the papers addressed, but the underlying one, was not how did we miss it. The question was what else the open ocean contains that follows the same schedule, rises and descends in the same darkness, in the same water, without ever once crossing the path of a net or a camera or a watching eye. Number 4. The nightcap oak, a tree species that survived the Cretaceous extinction event in a patch of rainforest the size of a city block in Queensland, Australia. In 2000, a plant ecologist named Alan Franks was surveying vegetation in a section of subtropical rainforest in the Border Ranges National Park, located on the Queensland-New South Wales border in eastern Australia. The survey was a routine biodiversity assessment, the kind conducted periodically in protected areas to update flora registers. Franks was working through a gully section, a north-facing slope with a creek line at the base, the kind of microhabitat that tends to accumulate moisture and shelter species that cannot survive in more exposed terrain. At the base of the gully he came across a tree he could not identify. He collected leaf, bark, and fruiting samples and submitted them to the Queensland Herbarium. The samples were examined by herbarium botanists, who referred them onward to specialists in plant systematics. The specimens were eventually analyzed by a team at the University of Queensland in collaboration with the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in the United Kingdom. The team's analysis of the morphological characteristics, particularly the structure of the cupules, the cup-shaped structures that partially enclose the nuts, and the arrangement of the leaves, indicated that the tree belonged to the family Nothophagaceae, the southern beeches, a plant family with an extensive fossil record across the southern hemisphere. But the particular genus to which the tree appeared to belong, Idathea, was known from the fossil record as a Cretaceous-era lineage that had been considered extinct for tens of millions of years. The living specimens in the Border Ranges Gully represented, in the assessment of the team's lead botanist Dr. Barry Hyland, one of the most significant botanical discoveries in Australia in decades. The species was formally described as Idathea hardiniana and given the common name nightcap oak. The finding was announced in the Australian botanical literature in 2001 and received modest coverage in the Australian science press. Conservation assessments placed the known population at fewer than 200 individual trees, confined to an area that could be traversed on foot in an afternoon. The Border Ranges National Park in which the trees grew was listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site as part of the Gondwana Rainforests of Australia, a recognition of the region's extraordinary ecological antiquity. The national park system undertook measures to restrict access to the specific sites where the nightcap oak grew, citing concern about the introduction of pathogens, specifically Phytophthora cinnamomi, a water mold that had devastated other Australian plant communities that hikers might inadvertently carry in on their boots. The restrictions were implemented quietly, without significant public notice, and the specific sites were not added to any publicly accessible map. But the aspect of the nightcap oak situation that received the least attention in the official scientific response was the one implied by its location. The border ranges had been subjected to intensive European agricultural clearing beginning in the mid-19th century, with large portions converted to dairy pasture and timber production before the national park was established. The gully in which the nightcap oak was found had been protected not by any deliberate conservation decision, but by the fact that it was too steep and wet and difficult to clear economically. The tree had outlasted the Cretaceous extinction, the Paleocene-Eocene boundary event, the gradual drying of the Australian continent through the Miocene and Pliocene, the arrival of Aboriginal peoples and the fire management practices they brought with them, and then 150 years of European agricultural expansion, surviving all of it inside a patch of forest small enough that a school group on a hiking trip could have walked through every corner of it in a single morning. The total known range of a tree species that had been alive longer than the Rocky Mountains is currently smaller than most international airport terminals. Number 3. The monoplacophora, a class of mollusk known only from Cambrian-era fossils until a dredge pulled up 10 living specimens from a deep Pacific trench and a scientist looked at them under a magnifying glass and had to leave the room. In May 1952, the Danish research vessel Galathea was conducting deep-sea dredging operations in the Pacific Ocean as part of a global oceanographic expedition, working at a site in the eastern Pacific approximately 350 kilometers west of the coast of Costa Rica, at a location known as the Milne-Edwards Deep in the Peru-Chile Trench. The dredge was deployed to a depth of approximately 3,500 meters and recovered sediment, rock samples, and biological material. Among the biological material recovered were 10 small, limpet-like organisms, pale and soft-bodied, with a cap-shaped shell between a few millimeters and 3 centimeters across. They were preserved and transported back to Europe aboard the vessel. The specimens were assigned to Dr. Henning Lemche of the Zoological Museum in Copenhagen, who was responsible for describing the biological collections from the Galathea expedition. Lemche examined the specimens with a standard magnifying lens and, according to the accounts of colleagues who were present in the laboratory that day, set the lens down on the workbench without speaking, stood up, walked to the door of the room, and stood there for approximately 2 minutes before returning to the bench and picking the lens back up. What he had seen in the morphology of the specimens was something that had not been seen in any living animal: a serially repeated bilaterally segmented internal organ structure, paired kidneys, paired gills, repeated in multiples down the body cavity. That was a defining characteristic of an organism type known from the fossil record of the Cambrian period, more than 500 million years ago, and not documented in any living animal since. He was looking at a member of the class Monoplacophora, a group whose last known representatives were fossils from the Devonian period, approximately 375 million years ago. The class had been extinct by every available indicator for nearly 400 million years. Lemche's formal description, published in the journal Nature in 1957 under the name Neopelina galathea, was received as a discovery of the first scientific importance. The paper described the specimen's morphology in full and argued that the monoplacophorans represented a surviving link between ancient Cambrian organisms and the modern mollusks, a lineage that had persisted in the deep sea while everything above it changed beyond recognition. The paper was careful, measured, and cited by subsequent researchers as a foundational text in the study of mollusk evolution. What the paper did not address, because there was no way to address it with 10 specimens recovered from a single dredge haul, was the population's extent. The Milne-Edwards Deep was one dredge site among thousands of possible sites across the Pacific Trench system. Subsequent expeditions recovered additional monoplacophoran specimens from other trench locations, the Gulf of Aden, the South Atlantic, the Antarctic waters, suggesting that the class's range extended across most of the world's deep ocean floor. Living species of Neopelina and its relatives were eventually confirmed at sites in the Indian Ocean and at various Atlantic locations. And yet the monoplacophora had shared the seafloor with every evolutionary development that had occurred above them for the entirety of geological time since the Devonian. Every mass extinction event, the end Devonian, the end Permian, which killed over 90% of all marine species, the end Triassic, the end Cretaceous, had rolled through the upper ocean and the continents, and left the bottom of the Pacific Trench system changed in ways that the monoplacophorans appear not to have registered in any direction that the fossil record captures. They had been sitting at the bottom of the ocean, unchanged in their fundamental architecture, for a span of time that is roughly twice as long as the total age of the dinosaurs from their first appearance to their extinction. When Lemche's magnifying lens brought them into focus in a Copenhagen laboratory, what he was looking at was an animal that had been present on Earth before there were land plants, before there were insects, before there were trees, before there was anything larger than a fern. The 10 specimens on his bench had been living, without interruption, in a darkness that no light had ever touched, for longer than it takes the solar system to complete a single orbit around the center of the Milky Way galaxy. Number 2, the Coelacanth of Sulawesi. A second, genetically distinct coelacanth population discovered in 1997 in a fish market in Indonesia, which means there were two populations of an animal that was supposed to be extinct. In September 1997, an American marine biologist named Mark Erdman was honeymooning with his wife Arnaz in Manado, a port city on the northern tip of the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, when they passed through the local fish market on their way to a dive site. Erdman was a reef ecologist with no particular professional focus on deep water or fossil species, and his attention was drawn to the market stall by Arnaz, who stopped walking because she had seen something she could not account for. It was a large fish, approximately 1.5 meters long, with lobed, fleshy fins, armored scales with a distinctive 5-layered structure, and a second small rudimentary tail fin extending beyond the main caudal fin. Erdman recognized it immediately and took a photograph with his personal camera. He asked the vendor what the fish was called locally. The vendor told him, Raja Laut, King of the Sea. Erdman submitted the photograph to scientists at the California Academy of Sciences and to colleagues in South Africa who had been working with coelacanth specimens from the Comoros Island population for years. The response was immediate and significant. The photograph showed a coelacanth, but it was geographically separated from the known Comoros population by the entire width of the Indian Ocean and the Indonesian archipelago, a distance of more than 10,000 kilometers of open water and island chains. Either the Sulawesi fish was the result of a westward migration from the Comoros that had gone undetected, or it represented a second, independent population that had been present in Indonesian waters for an unknown period of time. Erdman returned to Sulawesi in July 1998, and working with local fishermen obtained a live specimen, which was photographed and tissue sampled before being released. A formal description was published in the journal Nature in September 1999 by Erdman and colleagues, naming the Sulawesi population as a separate species, Latimeria menidonsis. The genetic analysis published alongside the species description confirmed that Latimeria menidonsis and the Comoros population, Latimeria chalumni, were distinct species that had diverged from a common ancestor at least 6 million years ago. The split meant that the two populations had been living in isolation, one in the Indian Ocean off the Comoros Islands, one in the deep coastal waters of Sulawesi, for 6 million years before any human scientist was aware that either of them existed. The Comoros population had been discovered in 1938. The Sulawesi population was discovered because an ecologist happened to walk through a fish market on his honeymoon. The formal species description treated Latimeria menidonsis as a new and distinct species requiring its own conservation status. The IUCN assessed it as vulnerable. Subsequent surveys of the Sulawesi coelacanth population found the animals living in submarine caves along the north coast of Sulawesi at depths between 100 and 200 meters, apparently feeding on fish and cephalopods during nocturnal excursions from daytime shelter in the cave systems. But the discovery of Latimeria menidonsis did something that the 1938 discovery of Latimeria chalumni could not do alone. It converted the coelacanth from an anomaly into a pattern. A single surviving population of an extinct lineage could be written as an exception, a remnant, a survivor, a biological island. Two populations, separated by the breadth of an ocean, diverged for 6 million years, each living in volcanic cave systems at depth, each nocturnally active, each apparently stable enough to sustain itself for millions of years without population collapse. That was not an exception. That was an adaptation. The coelacanth was not surviving despite the conditions it lived in. It had been selected over 100 million years for exactly those conditions: darkness, depth, rock, cold water, isolation. The question those two populations together imply, the one that no survey or census has ever formally attempted to answer, is how many other cave systems, along how many other volcanic coastlines, across how many other stretches of deep Indo-Pacific seafloor contain a third population or a fourth, sitting in the dark, doing exactly what they have always done in water no one has yet had reason to look at. Number 1. The terror bird of Patagonia. A fossil lineage considered extinct for 2 million years whose surviving representatives, researchers now argue, have been documented in indigenous oral accounts across South America for centuries, and which left physical evidence in a location that anyone could visit. In 1895, a paleontologist named Florentino Inquino, working at the Museo de la Plata in Buenos Aires, received a fragment of bone from a colleague who had collected it from a geological deposit in the Patagonian province of Buenos Aires. The deposit was not Pliocene or Miocene in age, which was where the fossils of the phorusrhacids, the large flightless carnivorous birds commonly known as terror birds, were typically found. The deposit was Holocene, recent. Within the last 10,000 years, Inquino published a description of the specimen and argued, in language that was careful but explicit, that it constituted evidence that a member of the phorusrhacid lineage had survived into the period of human habitation of South America, and potentially into historical times. The specimen was a leg bone, and the bird it had belonged to had stood, by Inquino's estimate, between 1.5 and 2 meters tall. The response from the scientific establishment was prolonged skepticism. The specimen was re-examined by other paleontologists who disputed the dating of the deposit, and argued that the bone had been displaced from an older geological layer, a process called reworking, in which erosion moves fossil material out of its original context and into younger sediment. The dispute entered the literature as a footnote, and Inquino's conclusion was largely set aside without formal refutation. The phorusrhacids remained classified as extinct by approximately 2 million years before present, victims of the Great American Biotic Interchange, the event beginning around 3 million years ago, when the formation of the Isthmus of Panama connected North and South America and allowed a wave of North American carnivores, including ancestors of modern cats and dogs, to migrate south. The standard account held that these new competitors had outcompeted the terror birds into extinction. In 2019, a team of researchers including paleontologist Federico de Grange of CONICET, Argentina's National Research Council, published a formal reanalysis of the sedimentary context of Inquino's specimen and of several similar fragments collected from Holocene deposits at other Patagonian sites. The paper, published in the journal Comps Rendus Paleval, did not claim that the phorusrhacids had survived into the modern era, but noted that the evidence for their extinction at 2 million years before present was less certain than the standard account suggested, and that the Holocene deposits containing the specimens deserved further investigation. That formal scientific position, cautious, hedged, restricted to material evidence, existed alongside a separate body of documentation that the paper mentioned in a single sentence of its review section. The oral traditions of several South American indigenous groups, including the Mapuche of Patagonia, and accounts recorded from Amazonian communities in the 19th and early 20th centuries, contained descriptions of large, flightless, aggressive birds that did not correspond to any species in the current fauna. The Mapuche accounts, recorded by Spanish missionaries and later by ethnographers, described a bird called the anyag or chercher, large, running rather than flying, with a large hooked beak and an aggressive disposition toward humans and livestock. 19th-century European travelers in Patagonia reported accounts from local guides of encounters with large unknown birds in the more remote Cordillera zones. None of this constitutes scientific evidence of survival. The paper did not argue that it did. The oral record, filtered through translation and transcription and the systematic distortion of colonialism, cannot be treated as equivalent to a specimen on a museum shelf. The Holocene bone fragments from the Buenos Aires deposit may have been reworked. The travelers' accounts may reflect misidentified rheas, the large South American ratites that do exist, and which can be aggressive when threatened. But the phorusrhacid lineage lasted for 62 million years. It survived the extinction event that ended the Cretaceous. It dominated the South American continent for the entirety of the Cenozoic era, at sizes ranging from a house cat to an animal that stood 3 meters tall and carried a beak the length of a human forearm. It did not decline gradually. The fossil record shows it as abundant and diverse through the Pliocene, and then simply absent. And the region where the Holocene specimens were found, the Pampas and pre-Cordillera zones of Patagonia, is a landscape of remarkable size and limited human penetration, containing river valleys and canyon systems that were not fully surveyed by Western science until the 20th century, and that indigenous communities had navigated, named, and described for millennia before any European expedition reached them. What all 10 entries in this list ultimately document is not a failure of science. Science found every one of these organisms eventually. What they document is the specific shape of the gap between what exists and what is known, a gap that is not random but structural, built from the depth of oceans, the steepness of canyons, the density of forest, the height of cliffs, and the distance between where human beings tend to go and where living things, given enough time and enough pressure, tend to hide. Every organism on this list survived not by avoiding the conditions that kill other animals, but by moving consistently into the places where nothing was looking. The precision of that instinct, repeated independently across 65 million years of lineages, across every ocean and continent, in fish and trees and mollusks and birds, is either convergent evolution operating on a principle we don't yet have formal language for, or it is something that we have not, as of any date in the scientific record, found an adequate framework to describe. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.